Hi, my name's Alexis. For the purpose of this assignment, I will be reviewing a toolkit called Adopting a Trauma-Informed Approach for LGBTQ Youth. I chose this toolkit because although I identify as a member of the LGBTQ community, I've never specifically studied LGBTQ inclusion in schools. I found the toolkit to be full of relevant and practical information, and I would highly recommend it to anyone in the education field. It's important to note that this is the second part of this toolkit, so it doesn't go into detail about what the trauma-informed principles are. Instead, it's a guide to developing and implementing a trauma-informed framework in school relating to LGBTQ communities. This toolkit highlights the trauma-informed framework and breaks it down into 6 domains. The first domain is building a trauma-informed set of knowledge and skills. This consists of all staff being trained on core trauma-informed principles, specifically relating to LGBTQ individuals. This means that there has to be training around LGBTQ vocabulary, myths and stereotypes, trauma that's specific to the LGBTQ community and youth in particular, including stigma, harassment, family rejection, health risks such as higher suicide rates, HIV, substance abuse, and homelessness. Additional training can be provided based on the position, so clinicians and teachers can receive specialized training relating to their positions. Specific training is required on issues that affect various subgroups, such as transgender youth. The transgender population has additional needs above and beyond that of the general LGBTQ population. Some examples of knowledge and training that can be provided are crisis intervention and prevention techniques, safety planning for LGBTQ youth, including school-wide anti-bullying campaigns that address LGBTQ issues, steps for helping LGBTQ youth identify triggers, targeted and indicated school mental health programs for youth exposed to trauma, including LGBTQ youth, strengths-based approaches for working with LGBTQ youth, including setting up things like gay-straight alliances and ensuring that the curriculum integrates LGBTQ issues and provides positive examples of LGBTQ individuals within the curriculum. And finally, there can be training around LGBTQ youth inclusion and engaging their families. Domain number 2 is establishing safe and supportive environments. It's important to create safe physical spaces for LGBTQ students in schools, especially around bathroom usage and locker rooms and things like that. It's important to ensure that the physical space is well lit, well monitored, and has inclusive signage, as well as displaying affirming posters and literature in public areas. For emotional safety, it's important to demonstrate respect by asking and using preferred pronouns, using gender-neutral, inclusive language in public communications, maintaining privacy and confidentiality. It's very important to not accidentally out students to their parents or to anyone else if they are not publicly out themselves. Additionally, it's important to implement LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. It is important to reduce the potential for trauma by minimizing triggers. This can be completed by always ensuring choice, control, and safe social connections, actively intervening when negative comments happen, and creating a culture of acceptance where adults lead by example. The third domain is providing trauma-informed assessments and services. Before I begin this section, it's important to note that not all LGBTQ youth have experienced trauma or have mental health conditions. They are at higher risk, but it's important not to pathologize the LGBTQ identity, which can sometimes happen inadvertently. For trauma-informed assessments, it's important to always protect the privacy and confidentiality related to disclosure of personal information, particularly as it relates to sexual orientation and gender identity. It's also important to offer options about who can be in the room during the assessment, offer breaks, be aware of body language that may indicate that a youth is feeling overwhelmed. And it's also important to consider cultural norms and expectations when greeting, engaging, questioning youth and their families. Trauma-informed mental health services are important as well. It's important that we use a strengths-based, client-centered approach, provide trans-affirmative care, normalize clients' sexual and gender identities, ensuring that they know that the goal is not to change them, but to help them accept themselves and to know that we accept them fully as they are in this moment. Additionally, we are to use approaches that focus on developmentally appropriate identity exploration, integration, stress reduction, coping, and family connection. The fourth domain focuses on involving youth and families. In order to involve youth, it's important to make sure that there are LGBTQ youth voices on decision-making bodies such as advisory boards, working groups, things of that nature. It's important to provide opportunities for youth to provide feedback on services and policies, whether this is through surveys or suggestion boxes, things like that. It's important that they have a range of options in which to provide feedback. It's also important to have a range of options for involvement so that youth can choose which level of engagement feels best for them. When it comes to engaging families, it's important to provide education about relevant topics for families of LGBTQ youth, to help families identify supportive language and behaviors, to meet families where they're at, and support even small changes towards becoming more affirming of their LGBTQ children. And also, it's important that we assess the level of family rejection. Domain number 5 is about promoting trauma-informed procedures and policies. It's important to evaluate the current policy at an organization, and when you're evaluating the policy, here are 7 questions that you can ask. Is this policy or rule necessary? What purpose does it serve? Who does it help and who does it hurt? Does the policy facilitate or hinder inclusion and control for LGBTQ youth? Were LGBTQ youth included in the development of this policy? Could this policy or rule re-traumatize LGBTQ youth or their families? For example, limiting control and choice and leading to fear and confusion. Some examples of policies that can be adopted include non-discrimination policies that include sexual orientation and gender identity explicitly, clear and non-punitive discipline policies, such as a calling in approach versus calling out, and restorative practices. Developing policies around when and when not to disclose a youth's sexual orientation or gender identity and to whom it's appropriate to disclose it to. A policy around tracking LGBTQ stats and outcomes within the agency, and a policy around continuous assessment and training about trauma-informed care as it relates to the LGBTQ youth population. The 6th domain includes collaboration across sectors. It's very important that we create partnerships in the community with providers who specialize in working with LGBTQ youth. When we're developing these partnerships, it's important that we ensure there's consistent language used across the board and that there's a consistent level of understanding and support for LGBTQ youth. It's also important that we have consistent policies and practices so that we can provide a united front as we address LGBTQ issues for youth. We also need to support cross-system awareness and knowledge building related to trauma and its impact on LGBTQ youth. So if we have knowledge at our organization or school that perhaps another agency doesn't have, it's really important that we have a way of sharing our knowledge and learning from the knowledge that other agencies have. Additionally, it's important that we share resources across service sectors. So if the education sector has access to some resources, but the clinical sector doesn't, then we can share resources that way. And also, it would be good to have a database of various services that we can help connect youth to that are in the network that we have established. So now we look forward to what's next. Adopting an agency-wide or school-wide approach to addressing trauma requires changes across all levels of the system, and this change doesn't always come easily. It's important to acknowledge this to staff at the beginning of the process and create a space for them to address any issues that arise. Changes must be made to observable practices and policies, and most importantly, to the underlying school or organizational culture that drives much of what happens day to day. The toolkit provides some steps for integrating and sustaining a trauma-informed approach, and these include educating leadership and staff, establishing a trauma working group, assessing current practice and identifying goals, adopting and sustaining trauma-informed practices, addressing unique accessibility issues for LGBTQ youth, and then finally evaluating the impact of your services and of the changes that you've made. Now that we've gone over the 6 domains of trauma-informed care and the recommendations for moving forward, I just have some final thoughts about trauma-informed care as it relates to LGBTQ students. Trauma-informed principles about LGBTQ inclusion are very important, but they can't happen on their own. They have to be in conjunction with trauma-informed principles in general, and it has to be an intersectional approach. All students benefit from implementing a trauma-informed framework in schools, and it's not specific to LGBTQ inclusion. I can see how perhaps this toolkit, because it's so focused on LGBTQ inclusion specifically, it might seem a little bit exclusionary at the surface, but if you break it down, you can really see how every student would benefit from a more inclusive, safe environment. And I think that's just really important to note as you think about working with students in the school system in general. And I would really recommend that anyone interested in working with children at all reads this toolkit just to learn a little bit more about inclusion and affirming the LGBTQ identity in youth. Thank you. And finally, this is just the reference page. You can find the toolkit at this link if you're interested in reading it.